He's 6 years old. You've just taken over his case. He's been in ABA for most of his life. The treatment plan is full of compliance goals, things like sit for 10 minutes, complete non-preferred tasks, tolerate transitions without protest. There's a pattern, escape behaviors, resistance, shutdowns, but the data says non-compliance. No one's asked why it's so hard for him to sit, or why he tries to leave every session, or why his body tenses the moment you say first, then. You feel it in your gut, something's off. But where do you go from there? Today, we're talking about the trauma assumed practices in ABA because most of us weren't trained to recognize trauma. It's not part of the verified course sequence. But what if it should be? Welcome back to Action Insights, the intersection of ABA and mental health. Welcome to episode 8, where we're going to talk about trauma assumed ABA, shifting from behavior to belonging. My name is Nikki Dionne, and this is my co-host.
Amelia Dalphonse.
And we're here today to explore how we can shift toward a more compassionate trauma assumed practice in our ABA work. Just really quickly, we're offering CEUs. We have a half of an ethics CEU for this episode. To earn your CEUs, you're going to click the link in the description and you can purchase the CEUs just for $5. You're going to listen for 3 code words. And when you click on the link, there'll be a quick quiz where you'll have to enter each of the 3 code words and submit that in order to receive your certificate. Our first code word for today is context. So our first code word is context. And I feel like this episode's going to come with a little bit of a disclaimer. I honestly feel like I come with disclaimers anyway. But Amy and I were chatting before we recorded, and we recognize that this topic is a huge topic. So what we're going to do today is kind of an overview of trauma assumed practice in ABA, why it matters, kind of give some general information. This is a passion area of ours. We have a lot of strong feelings about trauma assumed practice in ABA. So we will definitely have future episodes where we kind of dive more deeply into trauma assumed practice and, just briefly, because trauma assumed practice is not just direct client care, it's how we provide supervision, it's systems, there's just so many pieces to it. So stay tuned for more episodes. Amy and I were joking that I did a trauma assumed practice training and it's like 3 hours long and it's still just like, I mean, there's some interventions and some things to take with you, but it's not a full deep dive into trauma assumed practice. And then I made a joke that I talk a lot anyway. So needless to say, we can link that for you if you're interested in getting more information sooner. Um, but yeah, that's just my disclaimer. Also, we are talking about trauma and trauma exposure. And so I encourage anyone who's listening, because I live in a place that we could all have potentially had trauma exposure in our life, and the way that it integrates into our development and our, kind of experience in the world can be different. So please take care of yourself. We are not going to talk too specifically about, types of trauma and details today, but I did just want to let people know that we will be talking about trauma.
I think that's a really good point that we kind of, even in talking about trauma assumed practices, we tend to focus on the clients and not really considering the experiences of our staff or ourselves even, and how our own personal experiences impact how we view our clients' experiences. So
Yeah. And beyond this, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit more from a client perspective today. But I purposely say, as a supervisor, I don't know what trauma exposure my supervisee has encountered, nor does my supervisee know what kind of trauma exposure I've had as a supervisor or peers that we work with, collaterals and all of all the people that we come in contact with have the same likelihood of experiencing traumatic exposure, and we never know, right? Because it's not something that we can see when we meet people. So I do think it's an important piece to think about. But today I do think we'll probably talk a little bit more client specific. And, I think it's important to start there, right? Because we are we are working with clients. And, it's important to start to think about like, why are we talking about this? Like, why does trauma matter in ABA? And I think one place to live in is that, you know, not all trauma is disclosed. So I can think of many clients in my professional life who have very complex histories, especially those clients who are in long-term services. And I don't always have the information about all of the things. And I know in the past, if I don't have the information, sometimes I just don't even think about it. And if we're working with autistic individuals or children with, or even clients with, disabilities, our clients are 2 to 3 more times more likely to experience trauma or abuse in their lifetime than individuals who are not autistic or struggling with other kind of learning or, genetic or physical disabilities.
And sometimes families are aware and able to disclose traumatic experiences, and other times they're not, so sometimes things happen that parents don't even know about, and that information might come out over time if the child's able to talk about it eventually, or other times the child doesn't speak, doesn't communicate vocally, so they're not able to tell you about it. But there's always a risk of a child having a traumatic experience that no one even really knows about. So I worked with a child who, so I have two examples. One, the parent knows that there was a traumatic experience. The child was sexually abused by a neighbor, and she knew about it, and she was able to disclose that to me. And that was able to inform my practice and my approach with him. And it, so I say that, and yet I always go from the trauma assumed perspective, where I take a very compassionate, client-centered, assent-based approach. And so it doesn't necessarily actually change the way that you practice. It just does inform what you know about the child and their behavior. And then I have another example of a child who um, was he was in school and he was doing well in school, and then all of a sudden he regressed. And Nikki knows this particular client. He went from being verbal and communicating vocally, and he went from being to not speaking at all, and he went from wearing clothes to not wearing clothes, and he refused to go to school, and um, he was toilet trained and then he wasn't. And so there are signs that some sort of traumatic experience happened, but no one knows what it was. We believe that it's something that happened at school, and maybe there's somebody who knows and was present and witnessed that. But as far as I know, no one even knows what actually happened at school. And so how do we approach that situation when we don't even know what the trauma was?
Yeah. And I think, just taking a moment, like I think it just highlights what I said before, right? Like our clients are sometimes at a significantly higher risk of experiencing traumatic events, and we are not always going to know what has occurred. And I think that that highlights the difference, Amy, you kind of touched on it, between informed and trauma assumed, right? So trauma informed is that I have been informed, somebody has told me that trauma has occurred. And so now my response is after a known trauma, right? So we know it happens. We can kind of step into our interventions and our practice in a way that is informed by the traumatic event. But if I don't know that it happened, if I live in a place of a trauma assumed place where I proactively integrate trauma sensitivity into all of my services, I assume it may exist. I always say this, I lose nothing by practicing compassionately with trauma sensitivity, right? I lose nothing by doing that if somebody has not experienced traumatic or had a traumatic exposure. And I will make sure that I'm providing, good kind of appropriate services, A, for all clients, and for those situations where I may not know that somebody's experienced a traumatic event. Um, and I think it's really important to kind of think about like how, in Amy's example, if I'm just looking at it from what behavior is telling me, and I see all this regression, sometimes we see clients who have increased aggression, increased kind of typical like non-compliance, like they have, their behaviors appear more challenging. And if we approach it in a compliance only perspective, right, and we're missing traumatic exposure or a traumatic event that occurred, we are more likely to contribute to harm. And we are more likely to not see progress, either short term or long term, for the clients that we're supporting. So, kind of thinking about, I actually got in a conversation with a provider at one of the early intervention preschool places I do consultation with, where they were describing what somebody else had said to them about a child being like oppositional, defiant disorder, like at 3 years old. Um, and I am opposed to the word oppositional. So I should see these are the disclaimers I should come with. That's for another time. Anyway, um, and thinking about like a 3-year-old who's oppositional, but when you start to ask more questions, right? Like their behavior is has been reinforced or is protective because this child also has a significant trauma history in early development. I mean, they're 3, right? So once I start asking more questions and I'm like, oh, why are they living with their non-biological parent? Like, why aren't they living with them? Sorry. Why are they living with somebody else? Like, oh, why are they new to the school halfway through the year? Right? Like, if I start to ask these questions, then I'm getting more information about their history. And I'm like, oh, this behavior makes sense based off of what I know now about this child's last 6 months of their life, right?
You really have to be careful and asking those questions. And we use this word a lot in the last episode, curiosity. It's really important to be curious about all of the different experiences this child is coming to you with, even if it's a very young child, a year and a half, 2 years old. They have significant experiences. I worked with a 3-year-old who experienced the death of 2 siblings. He was 3 years old. His One of his older brothers passed away when he was an infant, and then a younger brother also passed away. And that's traumatic. And the family was living in poverty. That's also traumatic. And sometimes it's not even these big episodes that are traumatic. Sometimes what we might perceive as something that's a smaller event will feel traumatic to the individual. And I think that that's a key point to make, is that we're not the ones who get to decide what qualifies as traumatic. That the and it's there's a kind of a range of trauma, and not necessarily on a linear scale, but it's very complex. And it's not like you can say this child has had trauma and this one hasn't. But their experiences are unique and different. And so how do we kind of take into account and learn about all of the experiences that these kids have had that impact how they react, and um, how interventions that we're choosing affect them?
Mhm. And I think you bring up a good point, Amy. So we're not talking, I'm not talking like Amy and I aren't talking diagnostically, like
Yeah.
a person comes in and they meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Like we're not even talking that far into it. What we're talking about um, is when somebody experiences an event, right, that is overwhelming or distressing, and they perceive, so this is where it's hard because I know this perception is like, a private event, but they perceive the event as frightening, dangerous, or overwhelming. And I hope it's okay that I bring this up, Amy. You can shake your head if not. But Amy and I, we talk a lot about trauma assumed practice and we train and all of this stuff. And we were we were talking about how she and I could experience the exact same event. Is it okay if I talk about?
Yes. Yeah.
Or, yeah. Okay. So say we're both walking on the street and we witness a car accident. I'm going to disclaimer, everybody is fine in this imaginative car accident I'm talking about. But we both witness it. And I immediately like run over to the car. I call 911. I make sure everybody's okay. And I look back and Amy's like frozen. I'm not saying she would be, but let's just pretend, right? And we have different responses in the moment. And then kind of as we go down, like say days and weeks later, for me, maybe I'm like, oh yeah, remember that thing? Like I hope I heard everybody's okay. But Amy is experiencing fear and anxiety because of her perception of what happened in that situation. We both were together. We saw the exact same thing happened. And because my perception or my experience or my history in witnessing that car accident, it was scary in the moment. I worried about the people. I did the things I needed to do. But for Amy, based off her perception, her anxiety, or her past history, had a very different response. We may not know, right? And Amy, this could, we were talking like could be pretty true for both of us, right? Because we
Yeah.
have very different experiences in life. Now, say the two of us walk into a movie theater and we're watching a movie and there is a scene of a car crash in the movie where everybody is still okay. And Amy's like, you know what? I gotta go. And she steps out and she's gone for a while. And I'm just like eating my popcorn, enjoying the movie. And I'm like, what the heck's wrong with Amy? Right? Like I'm in this place of like, what's going on? And Amy, meanwhile, is experiencing a response because of her history of traumatic exposure. And this is an example that could be true for both of us and probably would be, I think,
Right.
right? Um, it's really about our perception and our history that determines if an event is traumatic. Now, say Amy and I both went into services for something totally unrelated. And we, as a BCBA, I wouldn't think necessarily to be like asking for every single thing somebody could have experienced. So it may never come up in conversation with Amy, with her provider, that she may have experienced or witnessed this car accident and it caused her distress. And then the provider says, we're going to get in the car together and we're going to drive somewhere. And Amy is like, heck no. And she starts making excuses. Maybe she refuses to get in the car. Doesn't show up for the appointment. She doesn't answer the phone. The provider says the same thing to me. We're going to get in a car and go somewhere. I'm like, cool. Can we get Starbucks on the way? I get in the car. I have a great session. Can you see where the two paths might lead differently? Now, if I'm just looking at it from an engagement perspective, I might say like, oh, Amy's not engaged and Nikki's super engaged, right? Now, if I come from a trauma assumed perspective, I might start to think, I wonder what it is about the way that I've set this appointment up that is working for Nikki, yay, but is not working for Amy.
And it might be that I don't even know how that car accident impacted me. So this is where there's a lot of work in the ACT realm could come in handy, because I might not even be making that connection between the car accident that we witnessed and my response to the movie, or my response to the person inviting me into the car, but if that person then forces me into the car and forces me to participate in that session, I might have a really strong reaction to that. And I was thinking about this ethics code 2.14. It actually says, that we don't do harm, so that I think that's really key, is that if we're pushing against our um, clients, pushing them into things that are making them uncomfortable without understanding why they're uncomfortable with that, then we're going to risk harming them. We're going to risk re-traumatizing them, even if it hasn't been disclosed to us that there's been a traumatic experience, or even if, so like Nikki said, if I react that strongly to a car accident, it's likely not it. I might have experienced a car accident in the past, but even if it's not linked to any of my history, it could just be linked to the stories I'm telling myself. It's a lot of these private events. I might be thinking what could have happened. I could be putting myself directly into that car accident, and all of this stuff is going on internally. And if I don't have the language to communicate that, or the self-awareness to even recognize that it's happening, then the provider can really cause a lot of harm.
Yeah. And imagine, now I'm going to throw a wrench into it. Imagine Amy and I are both 4 years old, and Amy's caregiver says, I literally can't get her into the car. And now we compliance-based intervention getting her into the car,
Yeah.
right? And that's what Amy's talking about, the harm piece. Now, my curiosity would tell me, I wonder what it is about the car. Is it movement? Is it the restraint of the car seat? Has there been something that's occurred related to car, right? These are questions now as a BCBA that I might be curious about, that I can integrate into my assessment with a family, right? When I'm gathering information. And if I can't get all the information I need, but I'm still looking at it from a trauma assumed perspective, I will adjust my interventions to allow for me to work on helping Amy get into the car, because it's important for her mom to be able to transport her. We have to get to school and to doctor's appointments, and sometimes she's got to come with mom to go grocery shopping, right? So I'm not going to ignore the goal of trying to get her to feel like to get into the car without challenging behavior. I'm going to shift my curiosity and I'm going to shift my intervention to get there. And so we're not talking about, sometimes there's this like weird, like, well, how do we do trauma assume, but also keep to the science of ABA? We're not talking about shifting goals. We're not talking about not providing intervention and collecting data and working towards those things that are socially valid for that family. All we're talking about is, how are we starting to integrate our own curiosity and reflection? How are we pulling in some concrete, like assessment tools or, questions? If, it looks like a compliance issue, how am I taking a step back, and what could the other explanation be other than just compliance or refusal, right? Like what could be going on? It allows for me to approach that client and that family with more compassionate care.
Right. And sometimes it's about the client not having the self-regulation skills that they need to manage those challenging experiences. And that brings us to our second code word, which is regulation. I pulled a page out of Nikki's playbook and I was able to integrate that right in there. So the second code word is regulation. Either write it down or use your voice to text if you're driving, and remember that the second code word is regulation.
And sorry, just get so excited talking about trauma assumed practice. Amy and I were joking that I like, I can't stop myself. No, thank you for integrating regulation. I appreciate you. Because this is where we start to think about private events and experiences, right? I can't, if Amy's 4, she can't say necessarily, my body is feeling, I'm in an aversive experience because I am scared. She might not be able to tell us exactly what her private event is. So how are we, assessing what might be going on for her in that moment?
And we're looking at behavior from a curiosity perspective rather than, and I mean, we're still following, like Nikki said, we're still true to the science. I used an example recently of like, I often compare ABA to gravity. Like the law of behavior is like the law of gravity in that it works, and it's all about how we apply the law and and use it. We can use it for good or we can use it for harm. And I used an example recently. You can jump out of an airplane and gravity is going to work. You're going to hit the ground, but you can also jump out of the airplane with a parachute and you're going to still get there using the law of gravity, but you're going to get there in a way that's not going to do as much harm or maybe any harm. And that's our goal for ABA. We want to use those strategies in a way that's effective, but also is not going to do harm. So we want to make sure that we're putting those parachutes in place when we're using our ABA strategies. We're going to be very selective in the way that we're doing that.
I love that analogy. It just makes so much sense to me anyway. Um, because I do think, it's looking at I just love it, like the law of behavior, the law of gravity, right? It doesn't shift. We're just what tools and accommodations and modifications and other things are we doing so that when we get to where we're trying to get to, the harm part is reduced,
Yeah.
right? Like I don't go to bed at the end of the day and go, what harm did I cause today? I want to avoid harm. And so like now it's starting to think about how do we start to shift, right? So for all of you listening, what are some things you can do to start to shift to a trauma assumed perspective in ABA? Because I will tell you that there's starting to be more research in our literature, behavior analytic literature, but there's not a ton yet, right? So if you're comfortable, I do encourage you to seek out other peer-reviewed, kind of journals in other fields. Psychology, the field of psychology has a ton of stuff. The American Psychological Association is a good place to start if you just want like a kind of brief thing, and they have some links to articles and things like that. Um, but what do you start to do as a BCBA to integrate this into your practice?
Yeah. And Nikki's CEU course is another great way to get more information. You get three, I think, CEUs for that one. And she goes a lot more into detail about some of the assessments that are available so that you can start to assess for trauma. And she talks a lot about more interventions that you can use as well. Like she said at the beginning, this is really just an overview of trauma assumed care, because in 30 minutes we can't really get to a lot of the nitty-gritties of how you would then now take this and go apply it, because we are coming to the end of this episode and we want to make sure that all of our kids who are in receiving services are safe, which brings us to our third code word. I didn't sneak that one in quite as smoothly, but our third code word is safety. And that's such an important part of ABA services, is having our kids feel safe in our care. And when we implement trauma assumed practices, that's actually going to be happening. So that third code word is safety.
And thinking too, we set up the environment for success, right? Like that's kind of our goal. People can't access the best place they're in to learn new skills if their environment is aversive, right? And so maybe good first step, if we're thinking about how do I start to shift to trauma assumed practice, is think about what kind of environment am I providing like what does the environment look like in which I'm providing services in? It's important to build safety and relationships with the people that we're working with before we even start to do intervention heavy. And this doesn't mean you spend like 27 months, just playing games and not working on skills. But what are the things that we start to do right from the second that we have that first contact with a referrer, a caregiver, client themselves, like whomever we're having that very first contact with? How are we starting to create an environment of safety? How do we start to talk about our own trauma assumed practice and why it's important? Those are some things that are important to think about and are probably a really good first step and are things that people are probably doing already, right? Like I'm not setting up the environment for not success, failure, whatever word you want to put in there. And so I'm already doing these things. How do I start to maybe do it for all of my clients, not just the ones that I know need specific environments?
Yeah, that's great. And speaking of specific environments, our next topic, we're going to be talking about pathological demand avoidance. And I know that Nikki has a lot of strong opinions about that one. And she also has another CEU course on that topic. But it fits so perfectly into what we've been talking about recently. And so many people have been asking more and more about this that we're excited to talk about that in just a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much for joining us on Action Insights and for, what we believe to be an extremely important conversation. We encourage you to keep leading with curiosity, compassion, and care, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you all.